The rain came in sideways that night, carried by a wind so aggressive it rattled the old shutters on the Reese house. On any other evening, the sound might have been a background hum, just another Pacific Northwest drizzle. But on March 18, 1999, the wind carried something else too. Something silent, deliberate, and unseen. Inside the house smelled faintly of vanilla candles and the roast Emily's mother had burnt earlier that day. 16-year-old Emily Reese had gone to bed at 10:07, her bedside clock glowing softly. At least that's what her parents told the police. Her door had been shut. Her music, a loop of piano instrumentals playing low. No alarms, no sounds, just the wind. By morning, the bed was empty. Her favorite hoodie was gone. The window stood open, swinging on its hinges like a whisper that wouldn't stop. Detectives would later describe the scene as cold. Not just in temperature, but in detail. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The house dog, an aging Labrador named Muttley, hadn't barked once. The back gate was closed. The grass below her bedroom window was soaked and muddy, but unmarked. Not even a smudge where a shoe might have sunk. The only thing unusual aside from the opened window was the clock on Emily's nightstand. It had stopped ticking at exactly 2:47 a.m. The battery, curiously, was still new. Her father would say he had changed it just the week before. He even had the receipt to prove it. No one could explain why a brand new battery would fail. But the clock stopped, and so did their daughter's life as they knew it. What people don't talk about enough is what a teenager leaves behind. Emily's room was full of clues, or so it seemed to the untrained eye. Photos taped to the mirror. Notebooks stacked by the window. A pair of pink sneakers kicked under the desk. The air still carried her shampoo coconut and something floral. Her laptop sat on her desk asleep, a school assignment half finished. Her inbox was empty. Her browser history cleared. Not wiped, but blank. The strange thing about Emily's disappearance wasn't how it happened, but how little of her remained in the space she'd inhabited. It was like she had unraveled overnight, as if someone had plucked her from the fabric of time, leaving only an echo. Her mother tried to recreate her scent by spraying her bed sheets with the same shampoo for weeks. Her father sat in her room every night pretending she was just late coming home. The local police had done their job. They knocked on doors. They interviewed friends. They pulled security tapes from traffic cams, parking lots, and the single grocery store that sat at the center of town. Nothing. A week passed, then 2. Emily became a face on telephone poles, a feature in the Sunday paper. Missing. Vanished. Without a trace. Rumors surfaced quickly, as they always do in small towns. Some said she had run away with a boyfriend. Others believed something darker. A local psychic claimed she saw Emily in a forest barefoot, calling for help. The police humored it, but only barely. The case went cold. By summer, her parents had stopped answering calls from journalists. By fall, her photo was fading from public memory, curling at the edges where the rain had seeped into the ink. The town of New Auburn, Oregon, nestled between endless pine forests and gray coastlines, was not the kind of place where children vanished, at least not before Emily. It was the kind of town where people left their keys in the ignition and waved to passing cars, whether they knew the driver or not. Emily's disappearance shifted that. Doors began to lock sooner. Porch lights stayed on longer. Parents walked their children to bus stops instead of letting them go alone. It was as if her absence cast a long, invisible shadow across the whole town, a reminder that safety was often a well-told story more than a truth. Her classmates returned to school that fall quieter, looking over their shoulders more. Her teachers left her desk untouched for weeks before finally boxing up her books. 23 years would pass before anyone touched that box again. It was a contractor named Avery Lockhart who found the floorboard. It happened during a renovation of the Reese house, which had remained unsold for years, sitting like a ghost in a neighborhood that had tried to forget. The house had changed owners 3 times since Emily's parents left, each family staying only a short while. It had a reputation. Lights flickering. Odd sounds in the attic. But none of that mattered to Avery, who was paid to rip up floors, not listen to whispers. The board was loose, oddly so, and below it sat a thick layer of dust. Nestled in that dust, hidden between two joists, was a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it, expecting perhaps a stash of old coins or forgotten letters. But inside was a leather-bound diary, the initials ER scratched faintly on the front. The pages were stiff with time, yellowed at the corners, but the ink was still legible. The first entry was dated February 2, 1999. The last March 17th. Emily Reese had written about someone named W, and in the final entry she wrote a sentence that would soon unravel everything the town thought it knew. If you're reading this, then he never let me come back. The diary was delivered in a manila envelope to the New Auburn police station 3 days after Avery Lockhart made the discovery. It was anonymous. No return address, no note. Just the diary worn and trembling with time and a post-it stuck to the front cover that said, "Found during the floor removal under bedroom 4. Detective Lena Maris was assigned to the case. She had been just a teenager herself when Emily disappeared, and she remembered vividly the fear that had crept through the town like a slow fever. Now, 23 years later, she ran her fingers across the faint letters on the cover as if it were a living thing. The entries were dated in perfect order, and as she read them that night under the sterile hum of her desk lamp, something inside her began to curl tightly. Emily had not run away. She had not vanished into the fog without reason. She had been taken, and she had been trying to leave a map back. The first few entries were harmless. Notes about school assignments, frustration with calculus, admiration for the red-haired girl in her art class. Then the tone shifted. Emily began mentioning someone named W. At first, it was subtle. A name dropped like a feather in the margin. Then full sentences. Then entire paragraphs. She wrote that W spoke to her online, knew her poetry posts, commented in a way that made her feel seen. He knew her favorite music before she told him. He quoted obscure lines from her favorite books. W was always awake when she was, always listening. At first, it felt like a miracle, a kindred soul. But then he began to show up outside her school. He sent letters. Once, she said a rose had appeared on her windowsill without explanation. Her parents dismissed it as a boy with a crush. But Emily knew better. She wrote that she had never told W where she lived, and yet he had found her. By the end of February 1999, Emily had grown paranoid. The diary pages turned frantic. She described her dreams, which were no longer dreams, but repetitions of the same event. A knock on the window, a voice calling her name from the tree line. W said he loved her in one message. Then the next day, he wrote that he would protect her from her own lies. Emily wrote a single chilling sentence that marked the beginning of her unraveling. "I think W is someone I know." The name was never written in full, just W. But in one panicked scrawl on March 5th, she wrote that he smelled like chalk and mint, that he wore a corduroy blazer to church, that he had been inside her house once when she was 10 and her father hosted a PTA dinner. Detective Maris froze. She remembered the PTA dinners. She had gone to the same school, and only one man had ever worn a corduroy blazer. Her old English teacher, William Ackerman. Detective Maris stood from her desk, heart pounding as if she had just stumbled into a secret too large to hold alone. William Ackerman had been questioned back in 1999. It was routine. He had been Emily's teacher for only one semester. Polite, mild-mannered, liked by everyone. He had given a brief statement, claimed to have no close connection to Emily. No knowledge of any letters or correspondence. Then he moved away. Left the state. The department had no reason to follow up, but now the diary whispered otherwise. Maris pulled the archives. Ackerman had left for a teaching position in Idaho 6 months after Emily vanished. No criminal record, no complaints, nothing. It was as if he had folded himself out of existence, but the diary said differently. On March 14th, Emily wrote she had seen W outside the grocery store. He had smiled, tapped his wrist like a watch. 3 days. That's all he mouthed to her. The last entry was written on the night before she vanished. It was shorter than the rest. Emily said her window latch was loose. She had heard footsteps on the gravel. The rain had started. She had tried to tell her mother, but the words got stuck. She ended with a plea. "If you're reading this, then he never let me come back." That sentence haunted Maris for days. It played over and over as she pulled every piece of paper, every name connected to William Ackerman. She found something small, a tax record. He had returned to Oregon in 2006, just for a month. He had listed a temporary address in Coos Bay. There were no employment records, no rent, no digital footprint. It was a ghost of a man, and yet the trail had warmed again. Maris called her captain. She needed to reopen the case. Emily Reese was no longer just missing. She was a voice loud and alive from underneath the floorboards. Maris contacted Emily's mother, now living in Washington. She had remarried, changed her last name, and had not returned to New Auburn since they sold the house. When Maris told her about the diary, there was a silence so complete it was painful. Emily's mother cried in a quiet, jagged way. Then she asked a single question. Did she ever mention a red barn? Maris blinked, unsure. She went back to the entries. There was one almost hidden, March 2nd. W says he wants to show me his secret place. He said the walls are red and the floor smells like hay. He said I will love the quiet there. Maris's skin went cold. She asked where this barn was. Emily's mother hesitated, then said it used to be her family's land, long since abandoned. Off Highway 12, behind a fence line of birch trees. Maris wrote it down. The silence between them stretched like old rope. Detective Maris stood at the edge of the gravel road just off Highway 12, the map crumpled in her jacket pocket and the wind tugging at the hem of her coat. Before her, a wall of birch trees bent slightly with the breeze, their pale bark catching the last amber light of afternoon. It had taken her 2 hours to locate the coordinates Emily's mother described. The land was not listed under any current ownership. County records marked it as dormant, once tied to a timber trust dissolved in the late 90s. Maris ducked under a fallen branch and stepped into the thick overgrowth. Her boots sank slightly into damp soil. After about 20 yards, she saw it. Tucked into the shadows like a memory too painful to face, stood a weather-worn barn with faded red siding and a collapsed overhang. The door leaned crookedly against its frame. Its silence felt expectant. The barn was colder than the outside air. Dust hovered in beams of sunlight, slicing through the broken boards. Maris moved carefully, her flashlight sweeping across rusted tools, empty crates, and moldy bales of hay. The floor creaked beneath her weight. She paused at the center of the structure, taking in the warped wood and uneven ground. Then she noticed something unusual. Near the back wall, a rectangular section of floor was framed differently. The boards were newer, slightly off color. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers across the edge. The nails were modern, not original. She pried one loose with a multi-tool, then another. The section lifted like a trapdoor. Beneath it lay darkness and a faint metallic smell. She lowered her flashlight into the space. There was a narrow tunnel carved into the dirt. It stretched forward no more than 6 feet. At the end of it, something glinted. Inside the tunnel, she found a tin lunchbox, the old-fashioned kind, with a metal clasp and flaking paint. Maris pulled it free with care and sat back on her heels. She opened it slowly. Inside were 3 items: a stack of Polaroid photographs, a spiral-bound notebook, and a black cassette tape with no label. The photos showed a girl with pale skin and long dark hair. She was wearing Emily's hoodie, the same hoodie described in the missing persons report. The first photo showed her sitting cross-legged on hay. The second showed her standing by a wooden door. The third showed her asleep, her wrists loosely bound. Maris closed the lid and exhaled slowly. There was no blood, no body, but something terrible had happened here. Back at the station, Maris digitized the cassette. It was old and damaged, but the audio came through in parts. The first minute was static. Then a male voice began to speak. He spoke slowly with an unsettling calm. He said she was safe, that he had given her peace. that the world outside was poison and she was better off here with him. He called her his quiet star. Maris sat frozen in her chair. It was not just the words. It was the tone, the way he repeated certain phrases like a mantra. He said she had finally stopped crying, that she had begun to understand. He never said her name, but it was her. It was Emily. Her voice appeared briefly in the background, muffled, pleading. The tape cut out after 8 minutes. Maris stared at the waveform, the silence at the end stretching into something too deep to name. She reviewed the notebook next. It contained entries written in tight, slanted script, not Emily's. These were from someone else, likely W. The entries documented daily thoughts. They were erratic and obsessive. Mentions of purity, rebirth, the cleansing of lies. He wrote about rituals of silence. He claimed that Emily had been broken by the world and that only isolation could heal her. He wrote about her resistance, her hunger strikes, her attempts to trick him. Then, suddenly, the entries stopped. No dates, no names. Only a final page where the ink bled into the paper from pressure. It read simply, "She finally heard the song." Maris closed the notebook with shaking hands. The forensic team arrived the next morning. The barn was sealed and photographed. The trapdoor and tunnel were documented. A team began excavation. Beneath the hay, more items were uncovered. A child's plastic comb, a shoe, a broken mirror, but no human remains. The soil yielded fragments of fabric, old ropes, and strands of dark hair. DNA tests would take time, but Maris already knew what the results would say. Emily had been there. She had been kept. The realization weighed heavier than the notebook in her coat pocket. The investigation, long buried by time and bureaucracy, had cracked wide open. The next step was locating William Ackerman. Maris contacted the State Board of Education. They had no record of him after 2008. His Social Security number was inactive, no tax records, no utilities. He had simply vanished. She reached out to a retired officer who had handled Ackerman's original interview in 1999. He remembered little. Said Ackerman had been cooperative but unremarkable. Maris asked if he had ever visited the barn site. The man paused. Then he said no. No one had. They had focused on the town center, the school, the local woods. No one had thought to check the family's old land. It had seemed irrelevant. Maris thanked him and ended the call. Her mind was already sprinting ahead. The barn became a restricted crime scene. Reporters hovered like crows around its perimeter, snapping photos and speculating wildly. Maris refused interviews. The case file now included physical evidence audio and partial DNA. It was no longer about a girl who had disappeared. It was about a predator who had created a hidden world and the girl who had written a warning under the floor. Maris filed a warrant to search Ackerman's last known address. She contacted the FBI. A new profile was built. One that did not describe a runaway. It described a victim, a survivor, a girl who even in silence had tried to be found. The drive to Ashland took Detective Maris 5 hours through winding back roads and rain-soaked stretches of farmland. She arrived just before dusk, her rental car humming quietly as she pulled into the gravel lot outside a modest roadside motel. This was the last address tied to a man named Walter Akins, a name William Ackerman had used on a part-time substitute teaching application in 2007. The application had been flagged because of incomplete references. Still, no follow-up had been made. Maris had traced a utility bill linked to the name, then a P.O. box, and finally a motel record listing Walter Akins for a 6-month stay in Ashland. The clerk, a gray-haired man with a soft voice, remembered a tall man who kept to himself. Paid cash, asked for a corner unit. Never returned after one spring. Maris asked if he had left anything behind. The clerk shook his head and handed her the room key. She took it, her pulse heavy in her throat. Room 22 was quiet sun-bleached curtains drooping over a rusted radiator. Dust covered the furniture. Maris moved slowly, her flashlight tracing the corners. The mattress sagged in the middle, and there was a faint scent of something medicinal long since faded. She searched the drawers, found nothing. Then she checked the closet. Tucked high on a shelf behind a loose panel was a box of old envelopes bound together with twine. Each envelope bore a different return address. None had been mailed. All were addressed to someone named L. The handwriting matched the notebook found in the barn. Maris opened one. It was a letter. It read like a confession. I have made a room inside the world for her. She has heard the quiet. She does not cry anymore. Maris opened another. He described dream symbols, fragments of memory. He spoke of a girl who burned too bright, a star too loud for this world. She had to be dimmed. She had to be protected. Maris sat on the edge of the bed trying to breathe. She drove downtown to the public library the next morning. The name L had to mean something. In the motel records, Akins had used a reference listed as Luann Kasler. Maris searched local archives. Luann Kasler was not a known educator. She was not listed in any school faculty directories. But she had once been a nurse, retired now. Her license expired 10 years prior. An old newsletter listed her as a volunteer for a faith group that held small prayer circles around Medford and Ashland. Maris called the contact number. The voice on the other end belonged to an older woman, cautious but kind. Yes, she remembered Luann. She lived in a yellow house off Pine Hollow Road. They had not seen her in years, but she was still around. Maris thanked her and set out immediately. The road twisted through the hills like a memory not quite forgotten. The house was small and covered in ivy. Maris parked along the edge of the gravel and approached slowly. The porch creaked under her weight. She knocked once, then again. The door opened a crack. An elderly woman with thin white hair peered out. Maris introduced herself, showed her badge, and asked to speak with Luann Kasler. The woman opened the door wider. Her voice was tired. She said that was her name, but she had not spoken to any police in a long time. Maris asked if she knew a man named William Ackerman or Walter Akins. Luann hesitated, her lips parted, then closed. She nodded and stepped aside. Maris entered the house and was struck by the smell of dried lavender and the faint scent of antiseptic. The living room was quite clean and lined with old photos. None showed a man. Luann sat across from Maris at a small table, her hands folded in her lap. She said she had met William at a retreat once, years ago. He was soft-spoken, lonely, troubled perhaps. He wrote letters, long ones. He asked her questions about morality, redemption, silence. Maris asked if he had ever stayed with her. Luann's eyes flickered toward the back room. Then she shook her head. No, he had written often, but he never visited. Maris pressed gently. She mentioned the barn, the letters, the tape, the notebook. Something shifted behind Luann's eyes. Her voice broke slightly as she said she had believed he was broken, not dangerous. She said he wrote about a girl but never by name. She thought it was metaphor. She thought it was poetry. Maris placed one of the Polaroids on the table. Luann stared. Then she whispered, "She is the one he called Quiet Star." In the hours that followed, Luann began to speak more freely. She said that William believed the world was too loud, too cruel, and that certain people were meant to be protected from it. He believed silence was healing. That light had to be hidden so it would not burn out. Luann had thought it was philosophy. She now knew it was something else. She said he once asked her about sedatives, about long-term care, about keeping someone asleep without harm. She had refused to answer. After that, the letters became erratic. He said he had found a place, a quiet place. She never heard from him again. Maris asked if she knew where he might have gone. Luann said he had once mentioned an old structure in the desert, a retreat center, long abandoned. Maris wrote it down. Back in her car, Maris contacted a geospatial analyst at the bureau. She gave him the coordinates from Luann's notes. Within an hour, he located an old facility in the Nevada desert. It had once been a Mineral Springs camp shuttered since the 80s. No records of ownership since 1991. No visitors, no lease, nothing. Maris filed for a federal search warrant. Then she contacted a ranger out of Carson City. He confirmed the structure was still standing. He said it was eerie. People avoided it. Rumors of disappearances. Maris packed her bag. The hunt had moved to the desert. The Nevada desert stretched out like an old parchment, sun-scorched and cracked in endless lines. Detective Maris stepped out of the black SUV provided by the Carson City field office and shielded her eyes against the blistering glare. The air was dry and still. No breeze, no sound, just the faint ticking of the engine cooling behind her. The ranger who had accompanied her pointed toward a weather-worn structure in the distance. It sat low in the valley, surrounded by broken fence posts and sun-bleached rocks. The building had once been part of a mineral retreat that shut down over 30 years earlier. Now, it looked like a forgotten bunker. Maris adjusted her radio and began walking the heat rising from the ground in soft waves. The building loomed larger with each step. It had no windows on the side they approached, just a single steel door reinforced with rusted bolts. Maris pressed her palm to the metal. It was hot to the touch. The lock was old but recently oiled. She turned it with a slow motion, the mechanism clicking open with surprising ease. Inside, the air changed. It was cooler, dense with moisture and something more sterile. The hallway stretched inward like the throat of a cave. Her flashlight cut through the dark landing on bare walls and exposed piping. No graffiti, no dust. Someone had been maintaining the space. Maris took a step, then another. Her boots echoed faintly. The hallway led to a main chamber square and windowless. The floor was concrete, the ceiling lined with exposed beams. At the center of the room stood a cot with a thin mattress. On the wall above it hung an old photograph of a child on a carousel. A plastic water jug sat next to a worn-out journal. Maris picked it up. The pages were filled with dates, no names. Just time markers and phrases. Day 1, she did not speak. Day 8, she touched the window. Day 12, she wept. Maris flipped through the entries. The handwriting was the same as in the notebook from the barn. She realized this room was not an escape. It was a continuation. A second silence. A deeper confinement. A place built for isolation under the pretense of peace. In a locked cabinet near the corner, she found medical supplies. Gauze, syringes, expired vials labeled with generic names. Some were sedatives. Others were nutritional supplements. Maris recorded each label, photographing everything with methodical precision. In another drawer, she discovered a wooden box containing several strands of dark hair tied with a red ribbon. Beneath them was a bracelet made from woven string and a rusted key. The initials ER were scratched into the underside of the wooden lid. Maris placed the box into an evidence bag. Her chest tightened. The bracelet matched the one described in the Reese family's original report. A birthday gift. Handmade. Thought to have been lost the night Emily vanished. Maris sat back on her heels. The silence pressed in harder here than it ever had at the barn. A second hallway branched off from the main room. Maris followed it, noting the narrowness, the subtle hum of a generator somewhere behind the walls. She passed 2 more empty rooms, then a third. This one was different. It had a locked metal door with a reinforced panel. It took 2 rangers to pry it open. The air inside was stale. A thin mattress lay on the floor with worn blankets and a broken lamp. A mirror had been shattered and its pieces swept into a corner. In the far corner of the room sat a small desk. Maris opened the top drawer. Inside was a cassette labeled Star 3. She took it carefully and added it to her kit. The second drawer held photographs. Dozens of them, all Polaroids. Some showed the same girl from the earlier set. Others were blurry. One caught her breath. It showed the girl standing near a door holding a book. In the corner of the image, part of a man's hand was visible. The photograph suggested she had been moved here. That she had lived here. For how long Maris could not yet tell, but the evidence was overwhelming. Ackerman had built a system, a pattern. Barn, then sanctuary, 2 sites, 2 lives, 1 obsession. Maris stepped outside to breathe. The sun had shifted westward. Shadows stretched across the sand. She felt the heat on her back, but her mind remained in that cold underground room. She had to know if there were others. Other girls, other names. She had to know if Emily had ever escaped. The next day, forensic teams swarmed the property. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the foundation. Dogs were brought in. Human remains were not found, but pieces of clothing, hair, and personal items were collected. The site was declared an active crime scene. Maris returned to her hotel that evening. She listened to the new cassette in private. The tape crackled with age. Then the voice returned, calm, slow, familiar. He spoke about the desert, about how time stopped beneath the sun. He said the girl had finally accepted the light, that her silence was the only music he needed. Her voice came in faintly once. A single sentence, "I am not a star. I am a person." Maris paused the tape. She pressed her forehead against her hands. The voice sounded older than before, more tired, more rehearsed, like a man justifying himself to an audience that never responded. Maris labeled the tape and locked it away. Detective Maris returned to Oregon 2 days after the desert site was secured. She felt like she had walked through someone else's dream, one stitched together from ritual obsession and control. Back in her office, the evidence sat in locked drawers, catalogued but far from understood. What disturbed her most was not just what she had seen, but what remained unanswered. There were no records of Ackerman's death, no trace of financial activity in over a decade, and no witnesses who could place him after 2010. It was as if he had dissolved into myth. Yet the rooms had been real. The tapes were real, and the voice, steady and slow, haunted her even in waking hours. Maris reread the transcript of the third cassette. In the margin, she had written a single phrase. He never mentioned the end. That absence felt louder than any word. Forensics from the desert site confirmed that the DNA found on the hair strands matched Emily's maternal line. It was not conclusive without her remains, but it was strong. Maris met with Emily's mother in person, this time at her home in Washington. The woman greeted her with tired eyes and arms that trembled when she reached for the report. She did not ask for comfort. She asked only for facts. Maris told her what they found. The journals, the cassettes, the room with the bracelet. Emily's mother clutched the key they found in the wooden box and said it had once belonged to her daughter's music diary, a book she had kept locked in middle school. Maris asked if the diary had ever resurfaced. The mother shook her head. Lost during a move, she thought. But now it seemed deliberate. Another small thing that had vanished without warning. Back at the station, Maris revisited the Reese family's former home. It had changed owners again recently. She reached out to the current resident, a quiet woman named Melissa Grant, who worked nights at the hospital and had only lived there for 6 months. Melissa allowed Maris to walk through the upstairs rooms. Everything was modernized now. The furniture was new, the walls had been painted pale blue. Emily's old room was now a guest space. But something pulled Maris toward the east wall, the one adjacent to the closet. She asked Melissa if any work had been done to that part of the house. The woman said no, but mentioned that her son once heard scratching sounds coming from the wall during the night. Maris asked if she could open it. Melissa agreed. A maintenance crew came the next day. Maris stood nearby as they removed the plaster carefully. Behind the drywall was a hollow cavity about 3 feet deep and 2 feet high. Inside, wrapped in a faded green towel, was a small metal box. It was locked. Maris used bolt cutters to break the latch. Inside were notebooks, letters, drawings, a photograph of Emily and her mother at a beach. The items smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Maris removed the first notebook and began reading. The handwriting matched Emily's diary found under the floorboards. But these entries were older. They were dated back to 1997, 2 years before her disappearance. One page had a title scribbled in bright ink. Names that make me afraid. The list included 3 first names. One of them was William. Another was Lisa. Maris froze. Lisa was the first name of Emily's sixth-grade piano teacher. Maris searched school records and located Lisa Marwin, who had worked as a private instructor for over a decade. She had moved to Idaho in 2001. Her employment record was clean, but Maris dug further. In 1998, Marwin had been investigated briefly for inappropriate messages sent to a student. The case was dropped. No charges were filed. Maris called the local department in Idaho and requested a welfare check. Lisa Marwin was found deceased in her apartment. The coroner estimated she had died nearly a month earlier. Cause of death was ruled natural, though the circumstances were strange. The power had been off. The windows boarded from the inside. Near her bed was a box of letters addressed to someone named Quiet Star. Maris requested the letters be sent for analysis. Back in Oregon, Maris cross-referenced the names in Emily's hidden list with every known contact in her academic and extracurricular life. Most were classmates. All but 2 had clean records. The second name, Darren J., led to a man named Darren Jeffers, who had been a janitor at Emily's school for only 6 months. He had a sealed record from a juvenile offense in 1986. Maris filed a motion to access the file. It revealed that at age 15, Darren had been charged with unlawful confinement of a neighborhood child. The charges had been dropped after the victim's family declined to testify. Maris tracked him to a trailer on the outskirts of Eugene. He had not been seen in weeks. Inside his home, police found a wall covered in newspaper clippings about missing persons. Several articles were about Emily. The pattern became clearer. Ackerman had not acted alone. Maris pieced together a timeline. Lisa Marwin had written letters in the same style as Ackerman. Darren Jeffers had collected stories about victims and drawn symbols on his walls. Each person Emily had listed had touched her life in subtle ways. Each had vanished or left a trace behind that now tied them to a broader web. Maris returned to the station and pinned their photographs on a board. She drew lines between them. Names, dates, shared affiliations. One word appeared again and again in the recovered writings. Sanctuary, not a location, a concept, a place where no one could find the truth. Maris circled it in red ink. Detective Maris sat in the dim light of her office, a single desk lamp casting shadows across the growing web of faces, places, and words. She stared at the bulletin board covered in red thread photographs and scribbled notes. At the center was Emily's face, younger than time should allow, surrounded by the 3 names from the wall diary. Around them, the word sanctuary had been circled over a dozen times. Maris reviewed the correspondence retrieved from Lisa Marwin's apartment. The letters were poetic but disturbing, each signed with variations of the same initials. Some were signed W, others simply S, and one with the phrase, "the first quiet." The language mirrored the cassettes. There was a reverence for silence, a disdain for the outside world, and an obsessive devotion to a concept described as the inner shelter. Maris now suspected that Emily's captor had been part of a closed system, one that supported and even expanded his actions under philosophical pretenses. The letters referenced a location known as Hollow Glen, once a communal farm in Northern California. The site was abandoned decades ago after a series of legal disputes. Maris found no digital trace of the current owner, but a land deed from 1995 listed a trust name connected to a now-defunct spiritual collective. The collective had no criminal history, but Maris discovered that 3 of its members had ties to children's education programs across the West Coast. One had worked as a counselor at a summer camp near Coos Bay in the summer of 1998. Another had been employed at a therapeutic boarding school. Maris mapped their movements. Several locations overlapped with timelines from Emily's early life. The proximity was not enough for a charge, but it supported a pattern. Maris received confirmation that Hollow Glen still existed in physical form, though it was now surrounded by barbed fencing and marked as private. She requested aerial surveillance and a quiet warrant for limited inspection. Maris arrived at the edge of Hollow Glen just after sunrise. The land stretched across a shallow valley hidden by trees and encircled by rusting wire. Her team moved carefully. They located a single house, 2 small cabins, and what appeared to be a communal hall. The main house was empty, the rooms stripped of furniture. One of the cabins contained several sleeping bags none used recently. In the hall, the walls were covered in symbols resembling those found in Ackerman's journals. They included spirals, triangles, and a recurring motif of a closed eye surrounded by lines like rays. Beneath one of the windows, Maris found a chalkboard. On it, someone had written a sentence that caused her breath to pause. The child cannot be returned until the world is made quiet. Maris photographed everything. Behind the hall was a garden long overtaken by weeds. Maris knelt near the soil and noticed a series of stones arranged in a precise formation. A circle 12 feet in diameter with a cross laid within it. In the center sat a rusted metal box. Inside the box was a list. Names, dates, coordinates, some were full entries, others were only initials. At the bottom of the list was a phrase Maris had seen before. She walks now in silence among stars. Maris recognized 4 names on the list as children reported missing in various states between 1994 and 2002. Most were never found. The list provided no locations of remains, but suggested the existence of a record-keeping system hidden behind coded phrases. It was a ledger not of crimes, but of acts justified by a shared belief. A detached structure near the edge of the forest contained old filing cabinets. Inside, Maris found binders filled with handwritten notes, copied pages from psychology texts, and letters addressed to the inner circle. These letters spoke of rituals of selection processes and of the importance of hiding light from chaos. One passage described the quieting, a process through which a selected child would be removed from the outside world and guided into silence through isolation and repetition. The documents never referenced violence directly. Instead, they cloaked their meaning in metaphors. Terms like cleansing, separation, and listening appeared often. Maris realized that Emily was not the only one. She was one of many. Perhaps the only one who left behind a voice loud enough to be heard. The forensics team recovered biological material from the cabin floors. Blood, traces, hair samples, and partial prints. Maris had everything bagged and logged. One notebook found beneath a false floorboard described a girl who refused to quiet. It said she screamed until her throat gave out. Then she whispered until she bled. Maris turned the page with shaking hands. The final sentence read, "She looked at me with hatred, and I understood love." Maris left the room unable to speak. Outside, the sky had shifted to gray. Her boots sank slightly into the earth as she walked away from the cabins. The sound of wind through the trees was the only movement in the valley. That night, Maris sat in her motel and reviewed the list again. She searched every name. 3 had matching case files. 2 were unsolved. 1 had been ruled a runaway. The rest were unknown. Maris circled the initials ER next to the date March 18, 1999. Next to it was a final column labeled status. Her hand hovered over the line. The word was not dead. It was not missing. It read, broken through. She copied the phrase onto a fresh page and underlined it. It was not an end. It was a designation. It meant completion. Maris realized that this network had believed in salvation through silence, and that Emily had been considered a completed work, not lost, not dead, but transformed. Detective Maris returned to her office with a heavy folder labeled Hollow Glen Evidence Set 3. Inside were newly developed photographs recovered from the detached structure near the collective's main hall. The film had been preserved in vacuum-sealed packaging, its canisters labeled only by year. Most images were faded, and many showed landscapes or buildings. But in the third roll, Maris found a series of portraits. Each subject appeared seated, their backs straight, their expressions vacant. The lighting was controlled, the frames centered. Each child looked no older than 13. None of them smiled. The photos bore handwritten numbers and dates. The second-to-last image made Maris stop. The girl in the picture wore a gray sweatshirt and a red beaded bracelet. Her hair was longer, but her eyes were unmistakable. It was Emily Reese. The date written in red ink beside the image read June 2002. That was 3 years after she vanished. The implications staggered Maris. For years, the official timeline had ended in 1999. But the photograph showed Emily alive much later. She enlarged the image, scanning the background. Behind Emily was a curtain with a peculiar pattern of vines and dots. Maris had seen that design before in one of the tapes recovered from the Nevada site. She opened her case notes and cross-referenced the tapes. The third recording had shown part of the curtain during a segment in which the camera shook briefly, revealing the corner of a room. Maris overlaid the images. The curtain matched, the walls matched. That meant the Nevada site was not the end. It had been a midpoint. Emily had survived that far. She had been photographed in 2002. The realization brought a tremor to her chest. She had lived longer than anyone had hoped. But the question of how long still hung unanswered. The photograph included something else. A reflection in the glass of a cabinet beside Emily. Maris zoomed in. The outline of a man was faint but present. He stood just outside the frame, his shoulder barely visible. She used enhancement software to isolate the reflection. What emerged was not clear enough for facial recognition, but suggested a tall figure with a thin frame hands folded in front of him. Maris sent the image to a forensic artist. 3 days later, a composite was rendered. The jawline, the hair, the set of the eyes all resembled William Ackerman. But the artist pointed out inconsistencies. The man appeared older than expected for 2002. There were deeper lines around the mouth. A thinning crown. Maris wondered if the person in the image was Ackerman or someone connected to him. A second observer? A partner? The photograph raised more questions than it answered. Maris turned her attention to the final canister of film. It contained only 5 frames. Each was underexposed and grainy, but in the last one Maris spotted something that stopped her breath. It was not Emily. It was not a child. It was a handwritten note held up to the lens by a small hand. The note read, "I am still here." The handwriting matched the samples from Emily's earlier diary entries. Maris stared at the photograph for nearly 10 minutes. The lighting in the image was artificial. There was a desk lamp. Behind it, a faint mark on the wall, possibly a crack or paint scratch. Maris enhanced the photo and isolated the object beside the note. It was a compact cassette recorder, the same model as those found at the barn and the desert sanctuary. This photo was proof of Emily's awareness. She had not been fully silenced. She had resisted. Maris began cross-referencing shelters, hospitals, and juvenile intake facilities in the western United States during the years between 2002 and 2005. She used Emily's medical profile and facial recognition tools to search through hundreds of unidentified cases. One file triggered a flag. A Jane Doe admitted to a rural clinic in Utah in 2004 had worn a red bracelet and displayed signs of prolonged isolation. Her age had been estimated incorrectly. She had been treated for dehydration and malnourishment. She stayed for only 2 nights and left without warning. No record of her departure was ever made. The clinic had closed in 2006. Maris located the last attending nurse. The woman, now retired, remembered the girl vividly. She said the child never spoke. She only wrote on paper. One note had read, "I do not want to sleep." The nurse had kept it, unsure why. Maris met with the nurse and examined the note. The handwriting again matched Emily's. She had lived, she had reached civilization, then she had vanished again. Maris reconstructed the timeline. Emily disappeared in 1999. She was held at the barn, then at the Nevada site and possibly Hollow Glen. In 2002, she was photographed alive. In 2004, she appeared at a clinic. That was the last confirmed trace. Maris now knew Emily had escaped more than once, but something had always pulled her back or pushed her farther into silence. Maris believed Emily might have attempted to disappear on her own terms. She was no longer just a victim. She had become her own ghost, one that knew how to stay hidden better than those who had tried to hide her. Detective Maris drove along the winding cliffs of the Oregon coast, her eyes scanning the horizon where the ocean touched sky in a line that seemed too straight to be real. The sun had begun to lower behind a gauze of mist. She was following the thinnest of leads. A call had come into the tip line 2 days earlier from a woman who ran a small photography shop in a coastal town called Miramar Bay. The caller claimed to recognize the girl from a newspaper article about the reopened Reese case. She said a young woman had once visited her shop in 2005, silent and cautious, with a red bracelet on her wrist and a box of old photographs. The shop owner had never forgotten her. She believed the girl had asked for help not with words, but with her presence. Maris had come immediately. The photography shop sat on the corner of a weathered boardwalk. Its windows were lined with sun-faded prints and antique cameras. Inside, the air smelled of developer fluid and cedar. The owner, Miss Delaney, greeted Maris with a careful gaze. She led her to the back where a locked cabinet stored undeveloped film and unclaimed negatives. She retrieved a small box labeled with the initials ER. It had remained untouched for nearly 20 years. Inside were 2 undeveloped rolls of film and a folded note. Maris opened the note gently. It read, "These are the memories I want to keep. Please find the truth in them." The handwriting was unmistakable. Maris felt her throat tighten. Emily had been here. The film was developed the same day. The images that emerged were grainy but clear enough. The first roll showed coastal landscapes, seascapes, empty trails, a lighthouse. But the second roll told a different story. The photos captured what appeared to be a small cabin hidden among trees with curtains drawn tight and no vehicle in sight. Several images were taken from behind a fence, others from a distance through branches. One showed a man standing on a porch. He had a beard and wore a broad hat. Maris enhanced the image. The face was partially turned but bore a resemblance to the reflection seen in the Nevada photo. Emily had been tracking someone. Possibly the same man. Possibly one of the accomplices. Maris added the coordinates of Miramar Bay to her growing map of Emily's movements. Maris returned to the shop the next morning. She asked Miss Delaney if she remembered where the girl had stayed. The woman led her to a nearby inn that kept paper guest records. Maris searched the 2005 ledger and found an entry under the name Livia Rowan. The handwriting again matched. Emily had created an alias using her own initials. She had signed in for 3 nights. Maris spoke with the current owner who had inherited the business from his mother. He remembered the girl vaguely. Said she stayed in room 3, quiet, alone, left no mess. He also recalled that she had asked for a ferry schedule to Crescent Harbor, a secluded inlet further down the coast. Maris followed the lead to Crescent Harbor, a place more wild than developed. Only a handful of private properties dotted the cliffs. Most were vacation homes or artist retreats. She knocked on doors, showed the photograph. Most residents remembered nothing. But one woman, a sculptor who lived in a converted lighthouse, paused when she saw the image. She said a girl matching that face had once appeared near her studio. Thin, silent, watching from the path. She had not approached, just stood for nearly an hour, then vanished into the trees. The woman had thought she was a ghost. Maris asked the direction the girl had gone. The woman pointed toward a forgotten trail called Haven's Bend. The trail wound steeply down into a narrow ravine where trees leaned inward, their branches forming a natural tunnel. Maris followed the path slowly, her breath forming clouds in the cool morning air. At the bottom, she found an old fisherman's shack, partially collapsed but recently disturbed. Inside were remnants of a fire, a tin cup and a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. In the corner, hidden beneath a loose board, Maris discovered a journal. It was water-stained but legible. The first page read, "For the day I choose to be remembered." The entries were dated sporadically across 2004 and 2005. Each one described brief sightings, small kindnesses, and reflections on identity. One passage read, "I am no longer her, but she is still me." Another said, "I left behind silence but brought its shadow with me." The final entry shook Maris. It read, "I will go inland soon. I have seen the last face. He walks the cliffs and calls to no one. He does not know I watched him sleep. I am not afraid of him anymore. I'm afraid of being found by anyone else." Maris closed the journal gently. It confirmed what she had come to suspect. Emily had not only escaped, she had reclaimed herself in fragments in motion in silence she controlled. She had documented her own aftermath. The ghost the world searched for had been real but not lost, just choosing her own narrative away from the voices that once tried to shape her. Detective Maris returned to Portland in early winter, the sky above her a flat sheet of pale gray and the air heavy with the scent of frozen pine. The caseboard in her office had grown to cover 2 entire walls. Names, places, fragments of letters, and photographs connected by red string and memory. She stood before it in silence, feeling the gravity of each line. Emily Reese had become more than a missing person. She had become a presence, a living resistance stitched into the margins of every document. Maris reviewed the latest forensic reports from the coastal shack. DNA on the blanket matched the mitochondrial profile of the Reese family. The pages of the journal had traces of ink identical to the samples from Hollow Glen. There was no doubt Emily had written them. The final traces of her path were not just echoes. They were deliberate. She had documented her own survival like a message in a bottle. 2 days later, Maris received a call from the State Historical Archive. A librarian had flagged a donation box from an anonymous sender. It contained a cassette labeled Quiet Star and a small envelope with a red thread tied around it. Maris arrived at the archive with a cautious heart. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It showed a young woman standing on a beach at dusk, her back to the camera. The red bracelet was clearly visible. In the background was the shape of a broken pier, the same one from Crescent Harbor. On the back of the photo were 4 words: "This is my ending." Maris sat down with the cassette and played it on an old machine. The tape hissed for a moment. Then a voice began. It was soft, raspy, older than the tapes from the sanctuary. It was a voice shaped by silence and chosen words. The girl on the tape spoke slowly. She said that people often imagined silence as absence, but it was not. It was a choice, a boundary, a space that she had learned to control. She said that the years she had spent confined were not blank. They were loud with the voices of others trying to shape her into something she was not. She said that when she finally escaped, she did not want to return to the world that failed to find her. She wanted to know herself without being defined by disappearance. She said that she walked away because she did not want to be someone else's tragedy. She said she did not vanish. She chose to live in the spaces no one searched. The tape ended with a long pause, then one final sentence. "I am still real even if no one sees me." Maris turned off the machine and sat in silence for nearly an hour. She felt the weight of the story settle across her shoulders like a winter coat. Emily had lived, she had fought, she had hidden, not to disappear, but to rebuild. Maris reviewed every timeline again. Emily had not only escaped multiple times, she had tracked her captors. She had observed them, documented them. She had left behind the tools that would eventually dismantle the very silence they had tried to force upon her. Maris updated her report. She labeled the case as resolved by survivor testimony. She included the recordings, the writings, the photographs, and a personal note. It stated that Emily Reese was presumed alive as of 2005 and that her final communications indicated an intention to remain unknown. In the weeks that followed, the department debated whether to release the details publicly. Maris argued for discretion. She believed the story belonged to Emily. The silence was no longer imposed. It was chosen. In the end, the case files were sealed under a victim protection clause and transferred to a private archive with restricted access. Maris visited Emily's mother and told her everything. She showed her the final photograph, the bracelet, the note. The woman held the items without speaking. Then she said something that Maris would carry with her forever. She said, "My daughter is not a ghost. She is a person who escaped. That means she lived. That means I can breathe again." Spring came slowly that year. The board in Maris's office was taken down. The case files were boxed and labeled. But the memory remained. One day, Maris drove to Crescent Harbor. She parked near the trail to Haven's Bend and walked the path down to the ravine. The shack was still there, half swallowed by moss and salt. She stepped inside and stood where the journal had been found. She imagined the girl who had sat there watching the light change on the walls, listening to the distant sound of the sea. She imagined her writing not to be found but to understand herself. She imagined the quiet as a shield, not a prison. She stepped back outside and watched the wind move through the trees. There were no answers in that moment. Only peace. A month later, Maris received a small package with no return address. Inside was a book. It was titled The Room with No Mirrors. The author's name was listed as E.R. The preface described a story about identity, silence, and survival. It was written in lyrical prose, fragmented like memory. Maris read it in one sitting. It did not mention captivity. It did not recount violence. It told of a girl who had once been seen too clearly by people who did not understand her and how she had learned to see herself without their eyes. It ended with a line that read, "I am not what they lost. I am what I found." Maris closed the book and understood that the story had ended not in disappearance but in transformation. If you found this story gripping, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime-inspired mysteries. Let us know in the comments what you think about the plot and where you are watching from. Your thoughts help us bring more stories to life.